Thank you very much for those kind words. It's an honor to present to you. I have some new data that I'll be working into my presentation today. But the overall goal of my 35 minutes with you is to get you depressed about the prospects for democracy, and then restore your faith that Oxford and you can help restore democracy in its fullest. Let me start off with a few words about the Oxford Internet Institute and our program for the next few minutes. I'm going to say a little bit about a few things about the evidence that we've been gathering in our project to study fake news, or junk news, and bots over social media. I'll tackle this question of what's next. So are there things we can learn about political communication from the last 2 or 3 years that will help us anticipate trends in the next few years? And then I'll say something about the strategy we have in our particular working group for tackling those threats to democracy. The Oxford Internet Institute is sort of a unique department. We're a full-on department within the unit, the social sciences unit, but we're a third humanists and a third computer scientists and a third social scientists. And our computer scientists have to learn the political theories, and our political scientists have to learn to code. And it's created over the last 15 years a really interesting mixture of people who can take on large scoops of data and try to answer some of the toughest questions in the social sciences. Luciano Floridi, my colleague, is one of the world's preeminent philosophers of AI ethics. Victor Mayer-Schonberger coined the term big data. He wrote the book Big Data. He made the business case for big data. He's the reason we all use that term, big data. My colleague Gina Neff, a sociologist, works on health tracking devices and studies how they impact the way we collect data about ourselves. For the last several years now, our project has been in the news a fair amount for exposing the ways in which junk news has an impact on public life. The mission for our particular group, the Computational Propaganda Working Group, is to address problems in civic engagement and to use social data science to solve those problems, to create new opportunities for civic engagement. Much of our work was launched by the National Science Foundation in the United States in 2014. In the last few years, in the next few years, we have a large grant from the European Research Council to support our work on computational propaganda. And it's the Ford Foundation and OSF that supports our public engagement work. Like a lot of science agencies, they're very interested in the basic science questions, but we turn to philanthropy to help us do the public engagement. Let me say something now about the evidence we've been collecting. This is evidence about the impact of social media manipulation on public life. There are many definitions of social science. My favorite is that social science is large amounts of evidence purposefully gathered. This means that we ask our questions first, and then we go into the field, right? We apply theories, we craft our questions, perhaps we formulate hypotheses, then we go about gathering data. Much of what we study, what we speak of when we speak of data, are bots. This is an example account. When you have a social media account on Twitter, you very quickly will find bots following you, trying to engage with you. Manually, sort of to the eye, it can be easy to identify a bot. Wild ratios of tens of thousands of followers with nobody following, or not following anybody and not having many follows, but tens of thousands of tweets. These kinds of imbalances are some of the manual heuristics for identifying a bot account. Sometimes these account names are all numbers, right? In this case, the bear might give it away. This is an account that tweets mostly in English. Occasionally it slips into Cyrillic and then goes back into tweeting in English. This is an account that started off being interested in how Israel was treating Palestinians. Then it became an account interested in the US election. Then it migrated to be interested in the Italian referendum, and then the French election, and then the French runoff election, and then the German election, and the UK election. It's an account that migrates over many of the world's great political contests. When we start a new scoop of data, for better or worse, we often start with Trump's follower list. I don't mean this as a political dig, I mean this as a methodology point. He has such significant volumes of fake users following him that when we need to start a fresh study, we often start with his accounts. These are accounts that have no pictures, have never tweeted, have no personally identifying information, are often simply numbers instead of names. Now, the real challenge to public life is not so much that these things exist, right? There's nothing inherently bad in the code. The challenge for our political conversations arises when these accounts push junk news in large volumes. Stories of Muslim women in doctored photographs storming your parking lots or crossing the borders from Morocco into Spain, ruining your holiday vacation. These are the stories that actually have an impact on public life. And the problem is that when tens of thousands of fake users push such content, that content jumps from being one that bots share with each other to being content that humans share with each other. Now, there are many different kinds of social science, and we try our best to do the multi-method stuff. So we take large scoops of data when we need to during particular political moments. We also combine that with qualitative methods. One of our doctoral students returned last summer from fieldwork in Poland, where he spent time with a company that maintains tens of thousands of fake Facebook users. In total, their stable includes 40,000 fake Facebook users. Politicians, however, are not the number one clients for these fake Facebook users. You don't buy them, you rent them. What industry do you think would rent tens of thousands of fake Facebook users at a time? Shout it out. What industry do you think would pay to rent 10,000 fake Spanish voters? Sorry? Media, good guess. It's not media. Many of the best forms of the bot software were developed for the Kardashians, so they are the innovators in this way. The code that drives their bot accounts is the same code that gets copied into other political campaign strategies, but no, not media. One more. What industry would pay to rent 10,000 fake Germans or 10,000 fake Americans? One more guess? Sorry? Not entertainment. Pharmaceuticals. Pharmaceuticals will rent 10,000 fake users to have a migraine, and then 10,000 fake users to have a new medicine that they've been trying to help manage migraines, and they have interaction in public, and this becomes the messaging that goes out. So politicians are not their number one clients. They certainly do lease these accounts to clients, but it tends to be lobbyists who pay for the largest volumes of use in their stable of accounts. So it's very important to tie what we can say about the millions of accounts to the political economy question of how this industry works. We match our qualitative with our comparative and our quantitative work. All in all now, we've done a dozen different countries. In this summer, we're working on a whole set of Latin American reports. As you know, there have been 5 or 6, depending if you count Venezuela as an election, there have been 5 or 6 elections in Latin America. Mexico is ahead in a few weeks, in 10 days or so. As we do our research, as a group of academics, it's become very important for us to release the findings that we feel confident about before the election happens. We produce data memos that help educate journalists about the stories that they need to cover. We've done our briefings in Berlin and Brussels, London, New York, and Palo Alto. Palo Alto was easily my favorite meeting. That's the one that had the most angry arguments. And we brief regularly in Washington, D.C. to help policymakers understand what impact these tools have on public conversations. We've done almost a dozen different countries now, another 6 or so to come. In the next month, we'll issue a memo on the use of bots during the Mexican election, but I want to highlight 2 particular reports that are coming across that cut across many countries. In a month, we'll release a study of what we call global cyber troops. These are the government-run programs. These are government expenditures to manipulate public opinion in their own country or in other countries. It's often authoritarian regimes that will do this work to manipulate their voters. But perhaps the biggest surprise in all of this work was seeing the communication strategy that dictators use to manipulate their own publics skip from being a strategy for manipulating their own publics to being one that they used to manipulate voters in other countries. And then to see that strategy skip again to become a strategy that politicians in the West use to manipulate their voters. So the strategy has migrated over many different kinds of regimes at this time, and many different governments spend significant tax dollars manipulating public opinion. The second report we'll do will be particularly on gender politics in several of the countries that we've studied. It's proven particularly easy to drive women out of public life on social media. Prominent female politicians, prominent female journalists, prominent feminists, women intellectuals are soft targets for these kinds of political communication campaigns, and unfortunately it's a common side effect or direct effect of these campaigns to push women out of public life. So we'll be doing a cross-cutting report on gender politics. Let me say a little bit about what we know about Russian operations during the Brexit debate and what we think happened. We know that Russian news sources were a fairly small proportion of the news traded over Twitter during Brexit. Barely 1% of the news sources that Britons were sharing came from clear Russian sources. We know that the Brexit campaign, the campaign to leave the EU, used 5 times as many bots as the Remain campaign. And over time, watching these accounts communicate, we've found it very increasingly difficult to separate what used to be the far-right Trump-related content from the Russian origin content. Right? When we used to make these big network diagrams, these were clearly different networks sharing different stories. These days, it's very difficult to tell these things apart. The networks are quite overlapped. The flow of content travels between the far right and the Trump supporters in the US and the known Russian accounts that generate much of this content. There's stuff we still suspect. There are things we don't know about the Brexit story. We think there was significant Facebook activity, but much of that data is gone, or it's with Facebook at the moment. About 6 months ago, we did a dedicated study of misinformation campaigns targeted to US military personnel who were on active duty for misinformation on national security issues. So these were targeted campaigns of misinformation on national security issues hitting veterans, their family, and active duty military personnel. We believe that there was a similar kind of campaign hitting NATO military personnel and UK military personnel during Brexit. We hope to be able to issue a report on that shortly. We believe there may have been indirect support for conspiracy and extremist content, and there's a multi-platform strategy for many of these kinds of campaigns. Let me entertain you with a fun story that involves Tinder. In the UK election last summer, the Labour Party figured out how to use Tinder, the dating application, to flirt and then talk politics. They wrote a set of bots with attractive pictures that would engage you in a political conversation and get a little flirty, and then introduce the notion that we should all support Jeremy Corbyn. The campaign managers behind this campaign went on the record saying that it worked for the constituencies that they were active in. There were multiple constituencies where the candidate won by a fractional amount, and the campaign managers credited the Tinder bot they had created as being part of their success story. So in many cases, we have large scoops of data, we have the campaign managers saying that it works, and then we have these political outcomes that we all have to wrestle with. One of the toughest things for us to do is actually track the contracting relationships between the big campaigns and the people who actually do this work. As many of you know, in most democracies, when you finish the election, campaigns are supposed to supply some records to elections officials that explain how expenditures work. In many countries, you only have to report 1 or 2 layers of subcontracting relationships. But in the social media world, you hire a social media consulting firm that then hires a social media analytics firm, that then hires an SEO specialist firm, or a Facebook or a Twitter specialist firm. And not all of those contracting relationships get reported to elections officials. That's what makes it possible to hide the use of some of these manipulative tools. Now, to really answer some of our questions about what went on in any particular election, we need to know true geolocation information on these account managers. We need to have a sense of where ads came from and whether they were all bought in one fell swoop from accounts managed in St. Petersburg. That kind of information is what we need to know to answer our deepest research questions. Now, this problem has become a global one. When we looked closely at what was shared in the United States over Twitter, we found a 1-to-1 ratio between the links to professional quality news produced by recognized news brands and junk news. Now, I don't speak of fake news because it is very difficult to operationalize a definition of fake news. You can't look at a piece of news and tell how much fact-checking went into that article. The best we can do is to offer some assessment of how truthful, how conspiratorial, how sensationalist a piece is. And so we prefer to speak of junk news, and we look for 5 things in junk news. We look for dirty words in the headlines, or we will look for headlines that are all capital letters with exclamation marks, multiple exclamation marks. These are some of the signs of junk news. But more subtle than that, we can usually spot extremist content, doctored photos, sensationalist comments. Much of the stuff that we count as junk news is what we all would recognize as commentary, masking as news. So commentary essays done in the New York Times font or with the BBC colors. That makes it look like news. So to repeat, in the United States, for every 1 piece of junk news that was shared over Twitter, there was 1 link to a professionally produced news article. I won't even joke about the tiny fraction of links to academic papers, white papers, or policy think tank papers. Over the multiple elections from last year, most of the countries in Europe and the UK had better ratios. In France, there was 7 pieces of professionally produced news for every 1 piece of junk. The UK and Germany had 4 pieces of professionally produced news to every 1 piece of junk. Unfortunately, these tactics are spreading fairly quickly. In authoritarian regimes, it's often military units that are retasked to doing social media manipulation. In democracies, it's often political parties that spend the big bucks on manipulating public opinion. Our project began initially as a study of what Russia and China were doing during elections in the West. We've found Russian activity. We haven't seen what China has done yet. We believe they have some capacity here, but we haven't seen evidence of their strengths yet. So let me say a little bit about what's next, because I genuinely believe that the deep threats to democracy are actually ahead of us, not behind us. I'll say something about short-term threats and then the long-term threats, and then restore everybody's faith that we can solve the world's problems. The first challenge for us, and many of you may be finding this in your own work, is that bot writers themselves are adapting. So as we publish our research and we write those little footnotes that not even my mother reads, but nobody reads the methodology footnotes, but bot writers read our methodology footnotes. And we use among the most basic definitions of bot. If an account is tweeting more than 50 times a day about politics using a political hashtag, it's probably a bot. Now, may I just do a quick show of hands here? How many of you actually would say that you tweet more than 50 times a day about politics? Is there anybody? The journalists maybe, the periodistas? Does anybody tweet more than? So I actually would have expected this argument would fall flat in front of you, but I firmly believe that beyond 50 tweets a day, you're probably using some automation in your account. But German bot writers have started producing content at 45 tweets a day. in response to our German published memo about their impact on public life in Germany. And so now we have to choose, yeah? Do we keep our methodology for the sake of comparison, or do we adjust the way we capture our data and lose the comparative perspective? One of the most serious short-term threats is actually from the genuine possibility of government over-regulation, government over-response. It's safe to assume, I think, that the Americans will never regulate any of this. It is very unlikely that there will be any kind of regulation to help manage the flow of political information in times of crisis or election. But it is also unlikely that the EU will regulate in the next 6 to 18 months in a way that has an impact on political speech in the United States and in democracies around the world. When we do this research, we always send it to social media firms, right? At the same time we send it to a journalist under embargo, we send it to the firms so that they know it's coming. Those firms, engineers at Facebook have told me that it will be impossible for Facebook to roll out a Europe-specific response to GDPR. They will have to make a global platform change. And anything that Europe does to regulate political speech will probably shape political speech globally because of this infrastructure constraint. So one of my most serious concerns now is that some governments are thinking of regulating quite seriously, quite onerously political speech on social media. Social media companies are digging in. They don't want to share data, right? Many of us play with social media data, but social media firms don't make it easy to learn about public life. The evidence is disappearing. These accounts are gone, right, when users identify them. And thinking ahead behind the questions, the big elections this year, Brazil in the fall, Colombia just happened, Mexico is ahead, Venezuela sort of happened, Egypt sort of happened. We as a team decided not to bother studying Russia this time. We tried to study Rwanda, but it became unsafe for our postdocs. Malaysia might have been a good story, a good set of outcomes, but also ahead is Pakistan and Thailand, to say nothing of the European parliamentary elections that will be next year, right, in the EU. Many of these are countries where rumor results in blood in the streets during elections. And so the consequences of misinformation on social media in some of our emerging democracies can't be overstated. Let me say a few things long term, and I've tried to pick the most conservative things I could say based on what we know about the role between social media and political outcomes. Thinking long term, I think it's safe to say that every tax bill, every budget bill, every national security issue will have an automated campaign for it and another one against it. As I mentioned earlier, the original writ of our project was to study Russia and China. We've caught the Chinese working on the Tibetan community in exile. The Chinese have launched political campaigns in Taiwan to meddle in Taiwanese politics. We believe they have the capacity to shape public opinion in Europe and North America, but we haven't seen that at work yet. I put the EU here. Maybe that's unfair to the EU, but I do think it warrants being in this list because it will regulate political speech in a serious way. And what I think we should want is a set of light touch guidances from the EU, but it's conceivable that they'll go too far. Looking further ahead, I think all of the tricks that we saw during Brexit or the US 2016 election are about to become the kinds of tricks that get played out in single-issue politics. So when a lobbyist wants a piece of legislation passed, or a lobbyist wants to mobilize on for legislative relief on some particular issue, these tricks will be applied between elections. Despite what Cambridge Analytica may have said, I don't believe that real artificial intelligence has been used so far to generate political messaging. But at some point in the near future, as artificial intelligence gets better at reading your data, political messaging will be generated in a way that interferes with your direct experience with politicians. And many of us feel that we don't have direct experience with politicians now, but artificial intelligence will take the data from your refrigerator, the data from your credit card purchases, make political inferences, craft the face that you will respond to, and deliver that face to you over social media. I think the deepest, most long-term existential threat to democracy is actually a threat to science. There's many definitions of social science. There's also many definitions of democracy. And I think my favorite probably comes from George W. Bush. He said that democracy is the process of choosing the choosers. What this means is that we elect people who we expect to work for 4 or 5 years to then make the choices that we don't have time to make or we don't have the interest to make. And that process is fundamentally about choosing people, it should be about choosing people who believe in evidence, who believe in evidence-based policymaking, who consult with the technocrats, and don't politicize every single decision. Some of the accounts that we've been following over time have actually migrated from being about particular candidates and particular issues to being about science and public understanding of science. So, for example, there's been medical consensus for over 70 years that smoking causes cancer. It's not an open question. It's not debatable. Smoking causes cancer. But on social media, it's not all cancers, and it might depend on your brand, and maybe by gender. And here's a policy paper you should have a look at. Might be a conspiracy of science against you. We've seen these kinds of campaigns around climate change. We've seen campaigns to get you to stop inoculating your children. There's actually a flat earth campaign, which we studied because we thought it was a joke, right? This is the campaign that says that we should all believe the earth is flat. But following the social media conversation around this issue, it's pretty clear that not everybody thinks it's a joke. It's a serious campaign issue for some. There's also campaigns to make you fear artificial intelligence. It's going to take your jobs. It's going to run you over with an automated car, right? It'll come after you in some way. There are now multiple issues in which there are automated campaigns to get you to believe things that are wrong. I actually think that this is not particularly about those issues. It's about getting the public to elect politicians who go with their gut rather than go with evidence. And the deep threat to democracy is putting people in office who use that process. In English, we have this phrase, this policy phrase that is called evidence-based policymaking. The very notion that we need something like a type of policymaking that is called evidence-based is ridiculous in my mind, but it's part of this problem. We have significant amounts of misinformation that politicians themselves generate. Has a significant impact on democracy. Now let's look ahead, because I do think there's some serious things we should consider as solutions. I accept the cynicism, but I don't accept the fatalism. I don't believe that democracy must remain sick for much longer. There are challenges ahead. Some solutions are known, and with some careful strategy, we can restore public life. One of the nice things I think about our work is that the university gives us a bit of a neutral turf to produce research, right? Make the critique, stay close to the evidence. We don't make things up. We don't generate fake news ourselves. But this whole process has made me more confident in the role of academe in providing insight into public problems. This is a kind of question where your research actually does matter. Our engagement strategy, we have an engagement and a creation and a pursuit strategy. Our engagement strategy for the moment is to talk about how democracy needs itself a cybersecurity strategy. When most people think of cybersecurity, they think of encryption and ways of improving the flow of, rationalizing the flow of bits over the world's information infrastructure. I actually think there's an institutional challenge here. Our political institutions have been hacked. They've been socially engineered, and we need to develop the expertise to figure out how to defend democracy as a cyberstructural question. In my own little group, we're doing various kinds of policy leadership, assisting the Senate and House Intelligence Committee with their investigations, and Mueller's committee with his investigations. We've been advising at the EU level and the Cabinet Office in the UK. One of the most significant questions that I actually don't have the answer yet to is coming from civil society groups. Civil society groups, especially those working in Ukraine, have been under attack by Russia for so long that they now think their best defense is to write their own bots. They believe some of them believe their response strategy should now be to hire trolls, to use automation to defend themselves against the Russians because the attack, the onslaught is so serious. I think increasingly we're going to have some of the actors that we believe in as we like to think of as civically minded, turning to political communication tactics like these as a self-defense strategy. Finally, I believe in a deep way that our engagement strategy has to involve open real-time social science. So we generate these reports, we share them fairly quickly with journalists, we work hard on dissemination. At this point, I'd say a third of my time is spent on working with journalists on research dissemination. And real-time social science still means a month. It takes a month for us to scoop the data, say 3 basic things about what we see, and get it out in time. That's pretty fast for academic research. This stuff doesn't go through peer review. Eventually it goes through peer review, but the data memos that we do don't see peer review. They see collegial review. It's still a month to tell a good story on a particular election. For our creation strategy, we're working on a Center for Democracy and Technology, and this center will have several kinds of goals. If AI can be used to generate the messaging that is customized for you, perhaps we can use artificial intelligence to catch the junk news, to identify it and flag it. There may also be ways to use blockchain to watch a journalist create a news story and then have it edited by an editor and then published by the publisher and then watch it go out into the public sphere and then perhaps catch it being re-edited by another actor. Blockchain technologies may help us trace the evolution of a story. And ultimately, I think the pursuit of truth is helpful here. There are many ways that this could all discourage us, right, to not want to study political communication or give up on democracy. But I do believe that the facts matter. I do believe that it's important to give voice, to be able to point out what mistakes have happened and how public life can be infected by social media in important times. So I'm happy to take questions. It's been an honor to present to you today. Thank you for your time.